Hello and welcome to the program on Form 990. On behalf of Aurora Training Advantage, I would like to thank you for joining us. Your guest speaker today is Tracy Paglia. Tracy is a tax partner with Moss Adams LLP. She has over 19 years of public accounting experience identifying and meeting the tax and consulting needs of nonprofit and exempt healthcare clients, their for-profit affiliates and donors. Her expertise includes areas such as attaining, maintaining, and termination of tax-exempt status, preparing and analyzing the Form 990, forming an operation in joint ventures and for-profit subsidiaries, and charitable planning options for donors. Tracy is a highly rated national speaker on tax-exempt issues. Her teaching and speaking experience includes sessions for the National Association of College and University Business Officers, the American Institute of CPAs, Council on Foundations, Leading Age, and American Society of Association Executives. Questions can be entered in your control panel, and as many as possible will be answered at the end of the presentation. For those interested in CPE credit, there will be a series of polling questions throughout the program, and all of them must be answered to qualify. If you didn't receive the handouts this morning, you can retrieve them from the handout section in your GoToWebinar control panel. Let's start off with our first polling question. And again, these questions are just for those of you that need CPE credit. Those of you that don't need it, feel free to pass on these. Okay, Tracy, it looks like we have about 44% for nonprofit, 46% for a public accounting firm, and then the rest were others, 0 for personal accountant.
All right, wonderful. So glad that we have a broad representation of people on the call today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to join us for the session on Form 990. This is designed to be for people who possibly have a little bit of experience with the 990, maybe haven't seen a 990 at all, to those who are already preparing the form and just want to get to know it a little bit better. Because we only have 100 minutes and there is a ton of ground to cover, I do speak kind of fast, so I wanted to, at the beginning, introduce you to the handouts that are available in case if you didn't have a chance to download them. There are a couple of them in there, the first one being the Form 990 itself. So on the IRS website, if you want to look at the 990 and you search for the 990, you'll get the 12 pages of the core form, but you won't get all the separate schedules unless if you download each and every separate one. So we've gone ahead and put them all together into one PDF, which is 96 pages. Very helpful to have available as we're walking through the 990 though, because that would be the great place to take notes so that next time you prepare a 990, you have it handy and can remember some of the things we're talking about today. The second handout in there is the instructions, because the IRS did the same thing with instructions that they did with the form, where you have to download each set of instructions individually, which is a lot of downloading. So that PDF itself is very large. I would highly encourage you not to print that one, but definitely download it to your hard drive. It's over 300 pages, so don't print it. A lot of detail, but I refer to the instructions all the time when I'm preparing a return or teaching someone how to prepare a return, because the instructions have a lot of really helpful information, including a glossary and appendix, which I'm going to be referring to today. So that is the second handout. The third one is a document I put together a couple years ago for another presentation that is still very relevant, and this is the common pitfalls. We don't have a ton of time this morning, so I wanted to leave you with a handout of the pitfalls in case if we don't get to those sections of the slides, so we can jump over that and get to the section after it on unrelated business income if we're running short on time. So I will be covering most of these pitfalls as we go, but it's also a helpful reference to have later. The last one is a note sheet of the slides themselves, so if you'd rather take notes on that version of it, you've got that handy for you as well, and as a reference to look back to later. So onto the slides themselves. You've got my bio here, which was just read a moment ago, and picture so you at least have an idea what I look like. The agenda, that we're going to be going through today. We're going to talk about the Form 990. This is going to be an overview because we could spend many, many hours talking about the detail, especially when you get into schedules. So this is designed, again, to be a basic course to intermediate, and we're not going to have a lot of time to drill down into a lot of the detail. We will be going through schedules A through O and R, talking about common pitfalls and problems, again referring to the handout there if we don't have a chance to go over that in as much detail as you'd like. And we're going to do a very brief introduction of unrelated business income, again very high level because we don't have a ton of time, and we could spend a whole 100 minutes just on UBIT, which I've done regularly at conferences. I also like to give you tools. I pointed out the ones that we have in handouts, but at the last couple slides of the presentation, there's additional websites that I refer you to as free additional information, or websites that I refer to all the time as I'm working with nonprofits. So I wanted to give those to you as well. So the first question that I always ask when we start the 990 process is, which form should we be filing? Because our software is really good here at Moss Adams, where I practice now. But if we start down the road of preparing a 990 EZ, but we really have to prepare a 990, it's not fun to find that out at the end. So we always want to figure it out at the beginning which form we're filing, so we're asking the right questions up front, and we don't have to duplicate work. So first off, in the first box, the first row, there are organizations that don't have to file at all. Certain religious, government, or political organizations are exempt from filing. Think of your churches, think of your state schools, like your public universities, they don't have to file. Cities and states are government entities and don't have to file a 990. Also, if you're a subordinate organization included in a group exemption annual filing, you don't have to file a separate form. So an example that I have, I do a Masonic entity. So they are a C9 Lodge Association, so they have a state entity that filed for exemption from the IRS. All the local lodges don't want to have to file separate tax returns, so they provide their information each year to the parent entity at the state level, who consolidates that information and files on their behalf. It's the only way we can file a consolidated 990. So those lodges that are included in that group exemption filing don't have to file their own. It's a very small subset of entities, and so that's all that we'll talk about with the non-filers. The next one, though, has to file a 990N. So these are our smaller organizations that normally have gross receipts of $50,000 or less. I have a little asterisk there to refer you to the Form 990 Instructions Appendix B to talk about how to calculate that. It's basically a 3-year averaging of gross receipts. So if you're under $50,000 and you are not a 509A3 supporting organization, you can file an N. What this is, it's an electronic postcard that the IRS came out with in 2008, because in 2006, Congress passed the Pension Protection Act. Up until then, an organization could apply for tax-exempt status, and then if they were at this threshold that we're looking at here, they never had to file another form with the IRS. So a volunteer organization very commonly would file their 1023, be granted tax-exempt status, treasurers would change, records would be lost, they wouldn't file any more tax returns because they weren't required to, but the IRS would have no way to get a hold of them or to know if they went out of business or they were still operating appropriately. So that's why Congress in the Pension Protection Act put in this requirement that all exempt organizations that aren't in that first row have to file something at least every 3 years, or you're going to be automatically revoked. And you might have heard of a whole bunch of revocations that happened in 2009 because for 3 years these entities that were small hadn't filed tax returns. So it basically cleansed the IRS database of those exempt organizations that maybe weren't functioning anymore. They'd really gone out of business but hadn't officially terminated with anybody. Got them off the rolls, got everybody updated so the IRS has current information. So that's the 990N. It's filed now on the IRS's website. It asks all of about 4 questions, including current contact information, and that's it. Very simple, but still required or you'll get revoked. If you don't qualify for that, next is your 990EZ. It's only 4 pages plus a couple schedules, and those organizations with gross receipts less than $200,000 and total assets less than $500,000 can qualify. You can't be a sponsoring organization for a donor advised fund, you can't be a hospital, and you can't control another entity that makes 512B13 payments to you. All that is just payments of interest, rent, royalty, or annuity that are being deducted for UBIT or for taxable purposes like a 1120 C corporation that's taking a deduction for interest paid to a nonprofit parent. It's something in the code that gets to unrelated business income. So the IRS said, if you have those payments, we don't want you filing a 990 EZ because we want to keep a little bit more tabs on you. So those three groups don't qualify, can't file the EZ, and you also have to be under gross receipts of 200,000 and total assets less than 500. So if you don't meet any of those first three lines, you by default are into a 990. That is the form we're going to be talking about today. I'm not going to go over the EZ, and I don't have an example of an N for you either. However, there are some organizations that have to file a 990 PF. It's kind of the either or. Either you're filing a 990 or you're filing a 990 PF. Those are for private foundations. We are not covering those today because that's a totally different form, but they are in your materials. The 990 book that I provided to you, as well as the 990 instruction book that I provided, both have 990 PF in there. So if you're interested in knowing more about those, you at least can look at them and attend a different session relating to the private foundation filings. Finally, we have a 990T. That is for gross income from unrelated trades or business of at least $1,000. We're going to talk about UBIT a little bit and what it is, but essentially the IRS said it's really not fair if a nonprofit runs a macaroni factory. The macaroni factory does not contribute to their tax-exempt status, so they should be treated just like a taxable entity in relation to that macaroni factory. So that type of activity is going to be reported on a 990T and taxed either as a trust or a corporation, depending on what type of legal entity you are. So the 990T is also in your handout materials, both in the Form 990 book and the 990 instructions. So we'll talk about the T in the last section of the presentation. Next are the schedules. So once you get through figuring out which form you're filing, then you got to figure out if you have schedules. If you're filing a 990 EZ, it's a simpler form, an easier form, so only some of the schedules would apply to you. I have those up on the screen, and they are in your 990 book. So if you're an EZ filer, you could have to file one or more of these 8 schedules. The first one is Schedule A, which is for 501c3 charitable entities. These are the entities that if you give them money, you get to take a tax deduction. So those are your typical private universities, your hospitals, YMCAs, United Ways, the museums. That type of entity is going to have to file a Schedule A. And that just proves that you're not a private foundation because you meet certain tests. So we'll look at Schedule A little bit. Schedule B is your scheduled contributors. This is your donor schedule. This one is somewhat controversial because you have to include donor names and addresses, at least in the copy that goes to the IRS. So we'll talk about that one a bit. Schedule C is for political campaign and lobbying activity. So if you're an EZ filer, you might have to file this if you, for instance, are a C6 trade association and you do some lobbying or some political activity on behalf of your members of your trade association. Schedule E is for schools. These are, K through 12 schools, charter schools, private universities have to file Schedule E. Schedule G is for fundraising or gaming activities. So if your organization has an auction or does a raffle or a bingo night, those types of events are going to be on Schedule G. Schedule L is also very sensitive because this is our transactions with interested persons. This one is where you report potential conflicts of interest with board members, with key employees, officers, or their family members or entities they control. So we're going to look at Schedule L in more detail as well. Schedule N is for liquidation, termination, dissolution, significant disposition of assets. The IRS wants to know if there's a big change. We aren't going to talk about N today because it's an unusual schedule, but it is there potentially for an EZ filer, as well as Schedule O. And O is for other. Anything else you want to tell the service, or if you have descriptions that need to be provided, are going to be on Schedule O. Because the IRS does not like free-form attachments. And if you electronically file, you can't include free-form attachments unless they're specifically allowed. So Schedule O is where we put everything else that needs to be disclosed. So if you are fortunate enough to be a 990 filer and have the more extensive form, which is a 12-page core form, you could have any of those 8 schedules plus these other ones. So Schedule D is for supplemental financial statements. It's the detail statement. We're going to look at that one. Schedule F is for foreign statements of activities outside the United States. This is going to be your foreign investing, foreign grant making, foreign programs. That's all going to be reported on Schedule F.